Thank you. Thank you for such a kind introduction. We all know that from Ukraine to the transition to the cloud, from operational security to threat intelligence, from what we're discussing here today to conversations about norm creation so that they're practically applicable, the role of international tech giants cannot be overestimated. Moving forward, they're the ones who, in very practical terms, and I say that as a government official, lay the tracks for technological futures in terms of how our citizens, and therefore also governments and organizations, live our very digital lives. Therefore, it's such a pleasure to be on the stage together with Casper, who speaks to all of that at Microsoft across Europe. And in a true spirit of this dedication to dialogue, he's allowed me to approach the stage dressed as the Ukrainian national flag. So that also means I'm not starting a second career as a stand-up comedian, but that also means that we very much invite questions from the audience. I'll give the floor to Casper for a few minutes for opening remarks, and then whilst we have plenty of questions to fill the day before lunch break, we do invite questions from the audience as well.
Good. Well, first of all, thanks very much, Liisa. It's an honor to be on stage with you here, and it's great to be in Thailand. It's great to be at CyCon. A small secret before we came into the room, we sort of said, why don't we make this a little bit more of a dialogue rather than sort of a keynote speech and a couple of questions afterwards. And I think you also promised me, Liisa, it would only be easy questions when we open up to the floor, so we should keep to that. But listen, I'm really happy to be here at, of course, a critical moment, not least for those of us living in Europe, but I think also at a critical moment when we talk about cybersecurity writ large, but also as we talk about the role, or indeed the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. I have a past. I'll refrain from saying whether it's a dark past or a bright past in working for government, for NATO, for the European Union, before moving over to the private sector and working for Microsoft. So I will pretend at least I understand how that relationship looks from both sides. But needless to say, you brought the word into the conversation already, Liisa. It's difficult to talk about anything these days without looking at what is happening in Ukraine and, of course, the unjustified and unlawful war that is currently ripping through Ukraine. I began my own career in the Balkans back in the 90s, and like many others, I honestly did not think you would see traditional warfare in Europe again after what we saw in the Balkans. So to see this in Ukraine is devastating on so many levels. But of course, as many of the previous speakers today have also said and underlined, this is really a war where we see the hybrid dimension coming into full play. We see kinetic activities on the ground, but of course we also see a massive cybersecurity attack being played out in the virtual world. And although there has been many examples of that in the past, I think we haven't seen it at the scale that we have seen in Ukraine. And if I fast forward to some of the difficult questions I'm sure you're going to be asking, these as what does that mean for companies like Microsoft or other players in the cybersecurity domain or technology companies in a bigger scale? And I think the answer is it's a difficult situation to handle. It was difficult before the 24th of February. It's been difficult since the 24th of February. But I think it's also fair to say there is sort of a pre-Ukraine and a post-Ukraine in the necessity of the private sector to be on the right side of history, to fundamentally protect democracy, human rights, institutions, critical infrastructure, and that's certainly the approach that we've been taking in Microsoft as well. Perhaps before diving a little bit more into Ukraine, just a couple of words. Again, previous speakers have mentioned this already. I think it is incredibly important to focus on the lessons that we can draw from Ukraine. But I think it is also important, as many of you in the audience will know better than I, that of course Ukraine is one example out of many. And what we are seeing on a global scale is of course an unprecedented level of cybersecurity attacks being launched. I think we are seeing increased degree of sophistication in those attacks. And as we've definitely also seen in Ukraine, a lot of focus on destructive activities, not only ransomware, malware, with the intent of trying to extract financial opportunities. We're really seeing an increased focus on hitting critical infrastructure. We're seeing an increased focus on crippling institutional setups, or in this case, governments. What it did for us at an early stage was, years ago, a decision taken to become quite transparent and quite open about the threat picture that we see globally. So we published numerous reports over the years where we actually call out the kind of attacks we're seeing, but also the geographic places that these attacks are originating from. And it's difficult to be super positive when you look at data sets that indicates an increase in number of attacks and also an increase in the degree of sophistication. And I think this is where Ukraine is hopefully a game changer in bringing the private and the public sector closer together, so government and the private sector, and acknowledging that we have to work much closer together. Whether we like it or not, a company like Microsoft, like many other companies, are frontline operators in trying to mitigate those attacks, protecting our customers, whether they're private or public, protecting critical infrastructure. We have, I think, both a business responsibility, but also a moral and ethical responsibility to doing so. But I think there is also an acknowledgement that this cannot happen without a closer collaboration with the public sector. And in many ways, I think that's where we are finding ourselves now. The last point before I'm shutting up, Liisa, at least to begin with, is I know David Van Wiel from NATO. I'm not sure whether David is still in the room, but a good friend, the ASG for NATO, he spoke earlier today also about the kind of work that is happening inside NATO under his leadership, work that we find incredibly important also in Microsoft, and an area where we've been trying to support NATO the best we can. I'm not sure whether we spoke a lot about the upcoming summit in Madrid, but if I may just put in a little bit of a provocative statement here in the introduction, is to say that I'm really hoping that we will see at the NATO summit in Madrid, and also in the new strategic concept, an opportunity for NATO to work closer together with the private sector. I think whether we look at cybersecurity attacks or emerging and disruptive technologies, AI, quantum, etc., I think if nothing else, then the current situation towards the East has shown the need for us to work closer together, but frankly speaking, also the need for the private sector to acknowledge that we have an incredibly important role to play in supporting the alliance, in making sure that we are defending democracy, defending human rights, including with the technology that we develop and deploy. So fingers crossed that we'll see a couple of sentences, both in the summit conclusions, but also in the new strategic concept about what we can do to work together. We're ready to do that.
Thank you, and so much to pick up on here. So we'll kick this conversation off, and as I said, if you can indicate from the audience if you have questions. I think the last time we all met as 500 to 700 people in Tallinn for CyCon, none of us would have imagined that almost all of the opening keynotes talk about transparency. We lived in a world where the belief in it was sort of the world of mutually assured doubt in cybersecurity. And now almost every single keynote has highlighted and emphasized the need for transparency. And I think Joanna Weaver in particular mentioned that that's a pragmatic choice to be made. It makes sense to talk about what you're doing. So Microsoft similarly spoke very openly of vipers that you were seeing, both leading up to February 24th and then the week after, with quite precise technical detail. Some would argue more than ever been seen before. So where do you see that element of our conversations going? And partially, what's your hard sell to make sure that we keep going in the direction of transparency?
Yeah, listen, I think it's a great question. And again, I know everybody in the audience is very much knowledgeable in this area. But if I may just tell a small anecdote that goes back 5 years, on the 27th of June 2017, as many will remember, we had the NotPetya attack. And I was actually working for the government, the Danish government, in Jakarta in Indonesia when this attack hit one of the biggest Danish companies. No secrets here, it was Maersk, the shipping company. And I still remember how we were working to try and help Maersk in Jakarta because it basically wiped out their infrastructure, and they were unable to identify what kind of containers were coming in and out of harbor. But I also remember very clearly the concerns about going public, in this case for this company, but I think the same applies for many companies that are being attacked. Do you actually acknowledge that you've been under attack? Do you share the lessons learned or the kind of damage that have been done with those attacks? So I think if we begin with the transparency discussion in this area, I don't think we can find any cybersecurity strategies, whether it's in the European Union or in NATO, that doesn't recognize that this is a challenging area, but we do need more information sharing, and we do need to create formats where that information can be shared in a way that will make all parties comfortable with it. I think that's one part of the transparency discussion. The other one, if we just reflect a little bit on our own situation, Liisa, I said in the beginning, I think these are difficult and very hard choices, also for a company like Microsoft. Do we call out publicly that we see a number of attacks originating from Russia, from China, North Korea, Iran, etc.? Is that always fantastic for the business relationship in those areas? No, it's not. But I think there was a very deliberate decision taken in saying we have, again, a moral obligation, but I think also a business and a customer obligation to try and be transparent and to share that data with the hope that this becomes part of the discussion so that we can build up better resilience, bigger kind of collaboration between all parties so we can fight these kind of attacks. And having worked on the government side, I know how difficult the attribution discussions are, whether it's in national governments or whether it's in international organizations. But to some extent, I think what we've been doing with the reports we put out, including the special report we put out on Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, is getting very close to attribution. If you haven't read the report, I can recommend it, not only because it's a Microsoft report, but because I actually think it goes very far in also identifying the kind of links, also with specific services in Russia, what we saw in the attack patterns, etc. And I think that's an indication that the attribution discussion is moving ahead, both on the private side and also on the public side. And I think that is what is needed if we are going to be successful in mitigating those attacks. I think if I may just add one thing on Ukraine, we've also been very public in saying we've been working with the Ukrainian authorities both in the lead up to the 24th of February, but also after the 24th of February. We've even come public by saying we've helped migrate 16 out of 17 ministries to the cloud, a service that if you put a price tag on it, is probably in the vicinity of $100 million worth of services being provided kind of more to the Ukrainian authorities. I think those kind of examples we think have been necessary, but again, those are difficult things to go public with. But I think there is a new situation where more and more companies will feel that that's the right thing to do. And
again, a lot to pick up here, but...
And I promised you to speak shorter. I'm really failing on that. I'm so sorry.
We have a big clock staring at us. We're fine. So in transition to the cloud, it's such an obvious, more likely legal than technical challenge, frankly. And there's clearly the competing trends or competing interests. On the one hand, understanding that that's where technology is going. And that's where the world's moving, and we're in the 21st century, and cloud is inevitable. On the other hand, there's also the tendency in government and in regulation, and in how we both create and read norms, to believe that as long as data is inside our perimeter, it's also better protected because, no, it's ours. How do you see us overcoming that sense of A, false dichotomy, and B, the underlying assumptions in there that might no longer be true.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think you really point to one of the challenges we have, hopefully collectively, which is to get the message across that in the virtual world, putting something in the basement in a vault is actually not protecting it in the best possible way. My own colleagues will get nauseous now because I will use my mother as an example, but it's extremely difficult for me to explain to my mother, and it's probably because of my own shortfalls, that if you want to protect data, you actually needed to put it into the cloud, because that enables companies like Microsoft and others to issue our latest cybersecurity suite and the best protection we have around. One of the challenges in Ukraine, as many of you know here, was actually that most data was on-premise. You had servers in the basement, extremely vulnerable to attacks, whether physical attacks or cyber attacks. So one of the clear lessons learned, not only from Ukraine, but also from previous cybersecurity attacks, is you need a cloud adaptation strategy. And then, Liisa, I'm sure you're going to be tough with me in saying, do you have commercial interest in actually promoting the cloud? And the answer is yes, absolutely. We do have commercial interest in promoting the cloud. But I will also be very honest in saying, and if David and other colleagues from NATO will be in the room, he will be able to testify that is the truth, that we don't really care. Well, we care a little bit, but you can take your cloud business wherever you want, but take it somewhere. Take it to a competitor, take it somewhere, because we need to make sure that as we work together in protecting our societies, our institutions, again, our in this case, our European countries, cloud adaptation is an absolutely essential thing. And I think this is where I see the discussions changing ever so gently because of what we're seeing in Ukraine, both in the European Union. When we have discussions with counterparts, I see a slightly different approach where there is an acknowledgement that cloud is the foundation for protecting in the best possible way. I see the same happening in NATO. So I think cybersecurity is absolutely essential. But if you allow me just to put two other reasons why cloud adaptation is going to be essential, I would also point to the fact that from a sustainability point of view, from an energy dependency point of view, moving to the cloud is vastly superior to keeping on-premise servers. Numbers are difficult in this area, but our own estimations is that you can save somewhere between 80 and 90% of your energy consumption by going to the cloud. And I don't think I have to explain anybody sitting here in Tallinn in Estonia that the dependency on energy is definitely also one of the challenges in Europe as well. But then if you allow me just the last point, which I think is critically important for those of us that are Europeans, I don't think I've met any European decision maker who's not deeply concerned about Europe not making it in the digital economy. We're not perhaps creating the companies, the big unicorns of tomorrow on the same scale as you would see in North America or in Asia. But I actually think that one of the best possible ways of making sure that Europe will cut it in the digital age is also to have a pretty aggressive cloud adaptation strategy. And the funny thing is, who are the companies that will benefit most from a cloud adaptation? Quite often you will hear it's the big companies, but in fact, small and medium-sized enterprises have a huge return on investments because you get access to state-of-the-art technology, AI systems at an affordable price, in a model where you can scale up and scale down much easier than if you have to buy equipment for the basement.
But then when outside of a war, which often motivates action, I absolutely agree. If you look at the conversations, there's many red lines drawn, ranging from cryptographic key management. We'll happily, and then many national regulations say we'll happily trust cloud providers as long as we have both the private and public key, which then seriously limits cloud functionality. Since you can't do anything with what's in the cloud, it's effectively a data dump. There's the conversations about geolocation of data. There's conversations about what you can do with data and then what you can do with the information systems around your data and the granularity of that. So, outside of a major crisis that will propel all of us fast in one direction or another, where do you see both governments and cloud service providers taking the next steps to meet in the middle, to find the middle ground where we're no longer hitting each other on the head with key management or geolocation or whatever the stick du jour happens to be?
Well, I think the starting point, and that's certainly the approach we've been trying to take in Microsoft, is to acknowledge that those concerns are valid, that there are reasons why governments have some hesitations in moving to the cloud. Data protection, data sovereignty, if you want to use that word, is, I think, top of mind, not least here in Europe. And I think for us, that actually means also adapting our technology to the specific situation on the ground. And here in Europe, we spoke a little bit about it before going on stage. The digital sovereignty discussion is, of course, a big discussion, and I think a legitimate discussion where there are concerns about, will you be able to protect your data, whether it's personal or industrial data, if you put it into the cloud? Will it be accessible by others? And I think that requires us to work closely, but frankly speaking, also to listen very carefully to the concerns and make sure that the technology we develop has the kind of safety features that customers are interested in, again, whether they are private or public. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, that we have this, let's call it a regulatory freight train coming out of Brussels these days, perhaps less so on the NATO side and very much so on the EU side. And I think that collection of different regulations will deal very clearly, of course, with cybersecurity issues, privacy issues. You will have in that clear provisions on what the technology industry will need to do to be compliant. And I think not all of it will be easy for us to comply with. Not all of it will be areas that we will enjoy significantly. But those are the realities, and I think it will enable us fundamentally to deliver what customers are interested in. I think we have one big advantage in Europe, and that is we've made significant investments over the years in building up a lot of data centers, which is, of course, the backbone, the infrastructure backbone for the cloud, etc. And that has actually also enabled us to do something we call the EU data boundary, where we offer our customers the possibility to store data in Europe, but actually also to process data in Europe. Something we would not have been able to do a couple of years ago. And again, it's because of the $20 billion investment we've been making in data centers in Europe that it actually enables us to do safety features or provisions in Europe that I think comes a long way in addressing some of the concerns that we're seeing.
And before I push you further on that, and I could happily do that until the cows come home or go home, depending on where you're sitting. I see a question in the middle there and another few here. So let's see how fast the microphones travel and just go in there, right up here.
I'm impressed that you can see anything because I only see sort of heavy lights here.
Hi, Berenike from BAE Systems Digital Intelligence. Thank you so much for your speech, Mr. Klynge. It's really a pleasure to meet you again. And this was a great talk, though, so thank you. I do have two questions. And the first one being directed really at, public-private partnerships. You all can't hear this word anymore. And transparency. So we heard right now 3 talks in a row focusing on that topic. And from what I perceive, integrating private sector companies into governmental systems and integrating the data from private sector companies into governmental systems comes really with 2 major issues. So private sector companies, obviously, oftentimes use commercial off-the-shelf components which go along a long supply chain. And as we all, I am sure, aware, it's, not too difficult to implement backdoors and vulnerabilities along this largely uncontrolled supply chain. So this is the one question or the one issue probably. So the US introduced the cybersecurity majority model, right? But most of the governments, and especially in Europe, do not have such a system yet to control supply chains. This is the one hand, or the one thing. And then especially if we talk about NATO and governments collaborating, we have to think about adjusting classification levels, right? So probably governments will have to downgrade classification levels, whilst the private sector will have to upgrade and classify its information a bit more. So from both sides, we will have to see compromise. And my question to you here is, from your wide experience and the insights you just shared, what would be the technical solutions and the best practices you saw to even allow for those compromises to happen, and to incentivize both sides to do this compromise? And then the second question, which is also directed at Mart a little bit, is if we think about the supply chain, and if we think about sharing cyber threat intelligence, right? And we think about standardizing this, like from your experience again and from your insights into the field, how can governments engage in standardizing without restricting the private sector too much and restricting too much the private sector's ability to be agile and to be innovative? Well, as this is the key point of cybersecurity and cyber development at all. Thank you.
A lot to ponder there for you.
Yeah, sorry.
And we have 7 minutes and 47 seconds to do all that.
Person
No, I think, a short answer to a lot of relevant questions. I think you're pointing to areas where we need to listen, and I was trying to say that earlier on. I think compromises, yes, to some extent compromises will be necessary, but I think it's also about us delivering and developing technology that will actually give the kind of certification or the classification requirements that will be stipulated by governments. And I think we are seeing that being developed on the European Union side. As you know, there are a lot of standards, certification standards now being developed that we will have to comply with, that we will comply with. I think the compromise that you talk about is actually also happening through the dialogue. And I think this is where we can share expertise from the inside, what are we seeing, what is working with other customers, and then at the same time listen very, very carefully to the concerns that we're hearing and adapting our technology to that situation. I think I think you're right in calling out that there is a lot of focus on public-private partnerships, and all of us are using those words quite a lot. I had the pleasure of serving on a GlobeSec Council on Future and Security and defense issues chaired by General John Allen. And we came out with a report a few weeks ago, and one of the recommendations in that report was actually to create a high-level dialogue between businesses and NATO around economic security. And I think what we are seeing now, and again, it's not for me to determine that, but at least from my chair, what we're seeing is an increased focus on a slightly more formalized dialogue between the industry and NATO, and certainly also with the European Union. And I think that's a welcoming step forward. I think it also holds the private sector to account. It's not only about us sharing information with NATO, with the European Union, it's also us listening to the concerns or listening to specific requirements of NATO or the European Union. So I hope that we will see this, and again, a small hope that we'll have some text coming out of the summit in Madrid as well here.
There was a question right in the sort of middle back there somewhere. And not to be funny, but please make sure that your question focuses on having a question.
Was that a remark to me? Or?
He decided not to ask the question.
All right, there was another one on the side here, and then...
Hi there.
Let's take two in one, you and then Edgar's. Okay. Yeah.
Just wondering, what do you think of the concern of moving to cloud infrastructure, creating like a single point of failure where one compromise can impact a lot more because it's so centralized? Thank you. And
Edgar's, let's take you as well, just to...
Yeah, my question is a bit different. You talked about data sovereignty, and one of the key issues, that is one of the key issues. Many of the governments don't adapt cloud technologies quickly. As we know that applications have moved from mainframes to microservices from an architectural perspective, do you see that that could be also a trend in the future for cloud points of presences, for cloud DCs, where a cloud presence of Microsoft, for instance, could come to smaller countries like Estonia as well?
So two slightly different questions. If I understood, the first one was sort of a single point of failure. I mean, are you more vulnerable if you go to the cloud? Was that more or less it's difficult to hear up here? Yeah, okay. Again, I think that's a concern that we hear every single day with our customers, and certainly something I hear every single time I meet with a European Union decision maker or NATO decision maker. And I think I understand where it's coming from. I also understand that we have a particular responsibility to put people in the comfort zone by being super transparent, by developing technology that addresses those issues. But I do think that an important point here is just to recognize that in the world we're living in now, cloud solutions will be a better way of protecting your data at the end of the day. Is it without risk? No, it's not. But is it significantly more secure than having on-site servers? Absolutely. And I think that's definitely where the discussion is going. But I do think we have an obligation also to make sure that we work in addressing the concerns about the single point of failure as well. And I think your point about data centers, and I'll be very transparent here and probably step outside my sort of formal speaking notes and saying that I think one of the problems with the investments we've been making in Europe or around the world in data centers is that it becomes a commodity that everybody wants. And what I mean by that is that I don't think we can find any country in Europe who wouldn't like an investment in a data center. And I think that's a development that is only natural. It's also about sort of investing in digital infrastructure. I do think it's also important to say that there will be places where the market volume doesn't necessarily justify a massive investment in data center. And I think that's where we are now developing different models, partnerships with local companies to find a way of also making sure that we invest in the digital transformation as well. So I think you will see a model moving forward where it's not sort of a one-size-fits-all, but rather a more diverse set of investments in Europe around the world. Will we see more investments in data centers? Absolutely. It's going to be critically important for everybody that we do.
And I know there's other questions, and I'll invite you to chase Casper down later in the day, since we also are the last thing between you and your lunches, which is sacred. So to sum up, let's cycle back quickly to the strategic outlook. What will you see keeping NATO busy in terms of both cybersecurity and technology in general? And what's your expectation for Madrid?
I think I've been alluding to what I wouldn't say necessarily the expectations are, but the hope is. I think we will see the word cybersecurity feature quite heavily in the new strategic concept, although this is just me guessing. And I do think and hope that the summit conclusions will also point to the fact that Ukraine has demonstrated the absolute necessity of NATO to adapting to a new world, a new reality, where what began at the London summit with a focus on emerging and disruptive technologies that has sort of, created, there's been momentum around it. And now we see a new situation where I think Madrid will solidify the need for NATO also to adapt internally to respond to a new set of threats and challenges. And I do think that new world or that new reality will require NATO to work closer together with the private sector. There are many interesting things happening. I just want to point out the work around Diana, I think is enormously interesting, but also having a slightly more formalized dialogue, as I've said many times before, I think is going to be important for NATO, but in fact also for the private sector. I think it is so important that the private sector also feels responsible for supporting NATO at a moment in time where we've seen the geopolitical tectonic plates move at a pace that none of us hoped. But that's where we are, and I think we need to respond to that.
Thank you. And do you have any housekeeping before you let us go?
We do. So, first of all, thank you so much, Casper, Klynge, Liisa for a most interesting discussion. Thank you also to the audience for your questions. To you, we have a small gift as an appreciation of our, as a token of our appreciation. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks.